A very warm welcome and thank you for the honor of your company. I am Felicity Ezewike. That corruption and poor governance are key factors holding back Africa's development is not in question. What is, and has always been, is our resort to a singular method of fighting back corruption to improve governance. On One Slot today, our focus would be on how we can create multifaceted, enviable anti-corruption blueprint that all African countries can benchmark to improve on governance and infrastructural development. This premise does not imply the non-existence of benchmarks in other climes. Far from it. However, the question remains, is it domestication, harmonization, or implementation that's the bane of Africa? These and more are the questions my guest will be helping us to make sense of on the program. Samuel Kaninda is one of Africa Regional Advisors at Transparency International, TI for short. He was previously Program Coordinator, Public Sector Integrity, Africa, with the same organization. Before joining TI in 2013, Mr. Kaninda worked in the local government sector through the Pan-African Association of Local Government known as United Cities and Local Governments of Africa. His academic background is in public management. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us.
My pleasure.
There are plenty of reference modules on how the fight against corruption should be waged. The most recent, of course, is the Commonwealth Anti-Corruption Benchmark launched in April this year to support international efforts. Before that, there were the Jakarta Statement on Principles for Anti-Corruption Agencies. We had the UN Convention, the AU Convention, just to name a few. Let us start by asking, how related do you think these models are in the current fight against corruption? Is there maybe a pervading theme that is very widespread?
Thank you first for having me on your program. I would say you set the context quite right. I mean, the scene of it in terms of the existence of many instruments that lay out the standards and what we need to have in countries in Africa to be able to fight corruption effectively. So whether we talk about the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, or some of the protocols we have in regions like the Economic Community of West African States, these are complementary instruments, and having benchmarks like that of the Commonwealth that was launched in April this year are only adding to the existing tools and instruments, but it is also out of the realization that having those international instruments, conventions, protocols, without clear plans, without more detailed and laid out standards of good practices, we may not be going anywhere. And we being the African continent here may not see results, because you look at the continent itself in terms of countries that have taken some of these commitments, whether it is on the United Nations Convention, that of the African Union, or even those who have contributed to or participated in events that led to the adoption of the Jakarta Principle. These countries have adopted, they have ratified, but there's still something that is missing there. It is indeed implementation. There's need for political will and leadership to make sure that these commitments, these existing standards, are translated into actionable plans that, yes, take into account the local context, but we've seen that many of these high-level principles, if I may call them so, which guide the definition of these concepts, these standards, are applicable to any country on the continent and even beyond.
Let's jump on you rightly highlighted that we can't take all of them at the same time, but elements of it. Let's jump on the AU Convention itself. It does focus on Africa, and it has imposed mandatory obligations. You said some countries have already ratified it. I would like you to, if you can, make it as brief as possible so we can go to other areas. What are some of the key features of the AU Convention that you think is worthy of note at this time?
The most basic one is the importance to have a legal and institutional framework that helps and sets the global framework in terms of regulations, prevention, and prosecution of corruption that is noteworthy. And for those frameworks to be in place and actionable, you need to have institutions and mechanisms in place. But we've seen that those alone do not suffice. You also need to be to have in place laws that allow citizens and civil society organizations, the media, and all other non-state actors to be able to have access to information. Because we believe that in countries where public information is accessible to those who are seeking to do oversight of what is done by state entities, where transparency and also accountability are the order of the day, you will see that corruption is more under control than in countries where that is not the case. So these are some of the provisions, I may say, that are key. Some also of the provisions that are suffering the most in terms of implementation. So they are quite basic, but they are still suffering because you have varying levels of uptake and domestication, implementation, and therefore that's why we do not see the results that we would like to see on the ground.
The key word here we're looking at is benchmark. So I would put to you the question about, do you think that the AU Convention in the fight against corruption is setting a standard benchmark for Africa? If yes, how? If not, why?
I would say yes. It provides the guiding framework, but it's not sufficient. Let me put it that way. So it sets out the principles, what are the key features and standards of the fight against corruption in a given country. So you need the laws, you need the regulations, you need the institutions, you need your public service to adhere to certain principles of integrity, accountability, issues to do with the management of assets, even the recovery of assets. But if I would quickly pause on that, for recovery of assets, you would see that beyond what is provided for in the African Union, there was a need to go a step further, and there's this common position on asset recovery in Africa. And I believe the same is true for other areas that the convention covers. And for the public service, there's also a specific charter that addresses the governance of the public sector in Africa. So I believe it does provide that basic fundamental framework, but it needs to be complemented by other more detailed guiding documents to assist our states to implement many of the principles and these agreed standards at the AU level.
Yes, there are really great principles on the AU Convention, so to speak. But then again, we know that some of the key principles have to do with prevention, promoting transparency and all of that. As of 1st of January, you also talked about it earlier, that some countries have ratified the treaty. Yet, I'll make reference to the Corruption Perception Index produced by country organizations like yours. It shows that we're still in the red over a decade after the module was initiated. Especially on paper, you say the convention looks implementable. What are the drawbacks or inhibiting factors in it serving as a benchmark for the continent's corruption fight? You highlighted that there are some deficiencies. What are they, and how can we put them aright?
A key ingredient, I would say, is political will, because we've seen in countries where at the highest level of decision-making in the country, let's say from the president or the prime minister, depending on the country, where specific measures have been taken to make sure that first, the convention, whether the country has ratified or not. If they have not ratified, that they would do so. And based on that, they would have laws that are consistent with the provisions of those standards, those principles, and the good practices that are highlighted. Some countries even went to make new commitments in 2016 in London, but if you look at those commitments, you can trace them back or relate them to what we have in the convention already. So what is key is to have that political will, which translates into resourcing if the anti-corruption institutions or organizations are already in place, making sure that those are well resourced, they have the competent staff for their operations, the budgets that they need, but also key is the independence that they need to be able to implement and carry out their mandate. Those are some of the key things, and also to make sure that those countries allow citizens to hold those in power to account. So access to information should not be a luxury. It should be part of the normal running of a society where citizens can access information on budgets, how resources that are voted in terms of budgets in parliament, how are those expended, and to have access to all information to be able from the local government level all the way to central government. So we believe that if that will is there, and there's also the leadership, there's cooperation also among different institutions, because that sometimes come in the way when anti-corruption efforts are not well coordinated, they become counterproductive. We've seen countries where there are many institutions coming in or playing a role in the fight against corruption, where instead of fighting corruption, they begin to compete for resources, for power, and in the process, the fight against corruption begins to stall. We are not seeing those results. So that's what explains why after 2 decades, I think in 2023, it will be exactly 20 years since the convention was adopted, but you have the majority of countries still grappling with systemic and endemic corruption.
Quite unfortunate indeed. From what you've said, you've highlighted a couple of things, but I'm going to pick finance, political will, access to information, and, strong institutions. We'll come back and see how we can break that down in the time that we have. But for now, let's go on a very short break. When we come back, we still have the Africa Regional Director, one of them at the Transparency International, Samuel Kaninda, with us. Don't go away. You're still watching One Slot on News Central. My guest is still here. Mr. Kaninda, I want us to take two things here, and that is the connection between political will and strong institutions. How are these two connected, and how can they work if well cemented?
Well, firstly, political will is at the center, and we are highlighting this because we've seen that political will takes the shape of allowing these institutions that are supposed to prevent and deal with corruption in terms of investigation, prosecution, and sanctions to do their work without any interference. And that's one, but also, as I said, making sure that they are well resourced to do their work. And we mentioned here also the important role of the judiciary. So in terms of sanctioning corruption, because what the African continent suffers the most from is also the issue of impunity for corruption, especially for those who are politically connected or in positions of authority. And that's a key issue. Whereas where you have strong institutions that are only answerable to the law and the constitution of the country, and there's political will at all levels. And we wouldn't want to suggest here that the political will of, let's say, the president only or the prime minister, where that is the case, is all that is required. But the example or the lead should come from the top. So if from that very top, there is that political will that is clearly expressed, and beyond mere statement of intent, it should translate into action. That would also be able to easily trickle down, because the leader at the national level will make sure that the institutions are functioning to be able to prevent and address acts of corruption as they come up, and also to allow, as I say, it's a very key ingredient for all other sectors, be it citizens themselves, for journalists to do their work, because many of the scandals around corruption have been uncovered or reported by the media. And it is from that point that institutions that are responsible for investigating and prosecuting would take their cue from what is reported, which is still at the stage of allegations. And if they can substantiate what is being reported, the law will take its course. And we see in those cases that when people know, those who would be tempted to engage in corruption know that there are consequences for their act. It could go beyond just losing an income to being blacklisted and losing many of the things that sometimes are even immaterial. People would think twice before engaging in corruption. But what we see in countries where impunity is the order of the day, corruption also seems to have longer days before itself. But we believe that there are so many good examples that other countries can cooperate on to see how some countries have been able to set up strong institutions that are also deterrent for those who would want to. I mean, it becomes very costly for one to want to engage in acts of corruption. So we believe that that political will is key, and it shows the way. It makes sure that there are no hurdles or obstacles in the way of institutions that fight corruption, but also for citizens to demand accountability from those leading them.
Okay, you've answered one of the questions I was going to ask, but let's look at making it non-transient and not restricted to regimes or governments. Governments come and go. There is one pervading factor in Africa, and that's the fact that continuity is a problem. So when you talk about building strong institutions and then maybe the independence of these institutions, how is it possible for us to ensure that these things are ingrained in maybe in the law, so that governments don't come and change the setting to suit themselves?
Yeah. That speaks to the need to build strong democracies, because in democracies, it goes hand in hand with the rule of law. And in the rule of law, it is the law that guides. So it is anything that goes outside of the constitution of a given country is completely unacceptable, both for institutions, but even for citizens. They would not allow a single person, like we've seen in many instances, who would change the constitutional provisions, let's say, to stay on, and the longer they stay, they feel that they are not accountable to anyone. And here being, in most cases, heads of state or government. So we believe that strong institutions are key, in the sense that in a democratic dispensation, in democratic governance, where the rule of law is the order of the day, it is institutions, it is laws, procedures and regulations that guide anyone who comes into a position, and it's not a single person.
That's the challenge, isn't it? Building strong institutions is, I mean, that is the goal, but how do we go about it? Is it possible, in your thinking, from all that you've experienced, to see institutions, as you allude, without government influence? If yes, what do we need to make it happen? It's not enough to say we need strong institutions. How do we make this strong? I know different climate has different situations to deal with, but what are some of the key things we need to look at in making sure these institutions are truly independent? If you can respond to that in 30 seconds, that would be great. I know it's not enough time.
Yeah, no, I believe, again, I will just say it's a matter of ensuring that democratic the democratic culture that we need to have becomes effective. And we've seen in certain countries that when citizens feel that institutions are being overpowered by individuals, they also make sure that their voices are heard in many shapes, that they can take the law into their own hands, but still making sure that constitutional order remains respected in that case. But it's about making sure that the checks and balances are there to start with when there's no crisis, so that when a crisis occurs, you are able to resort to what your constitution and laws allow. But again, as I said, it's not always, it's the respect of our own laws and constitution that is also a key issue, but that's another topic altogether.
Indeed. Samuel Kaninda, Africa Regional Director for Transparency International. It's been a real pleasure talking with you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Scholars, including my guest, assert that corruption is a symptom of deeper governance, rather. They suggest that anti-corruption drives are more successful when they are integrated into the general governance architecture and when they are well domesticated. Therefore, having institutions alone without integration and independence cannot fight corruption. I've tried to get our guests to speak on that. That means there is much work to be done. Building institutions does take time. It does take time and not often deliver the quick results that typically attract politicians or donors who are also key players here. But it is essential if Africa is to fight corruption systematically and ensure long-term sustainability to ensure stability. That's our program today. Thank you for your kind attention. I'll see you next week. Bye for now.